Hey there, friend. Welcome to another gentle journey into the pages of ancient history, where tonight we'll be peeling back the layers of one of the most fascinating figures who ever walked the dusty roads of the ancient world. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. What city, what country, what time it is as you settle in for the night. There's something beautifully connecting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet here together, exploring the same incredible story. If this kind of peaceful biblical storytelling helps you drift off to sleep, consider subscribing. We have many more stories waiting to lull you into restful slumber. Now, dim the lights, pull those blankets a little closer, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We live in an age of secrets, don't we? In 2025, we think we understand what it means to have a hidden life. We have private browsing modes, encrypted messages, social media accounts our parents don't know about. We maintain carefully curated public personas, while our real thoughts live in group chats and close friend stories. We've got Ring doorbells that catch our neighbours sneaking packages, credit card statements that reveal our midnight shopping habits, and location data that knows we stopped at that drive-through we swore we'd avoid. But imagine, if you will, having a secret so profound, so world-altering, that it doesn't just change your Netflix recommendations or your targeted ads. Imagine having a secret that reshapes the entire trajectory of human civilization. Tonight, we're going to explore the hidden life of Abraham, a man whose secrets make our modern mysteries look like whispered gossip at a coffee shop. Because you see, while we're worried about someone discovering our Spotify Wrapped or finding out we've been binge-watching reality TV at 3 a.m, Abraham was carrying conversations with the divine. While we're carefully managing our online presence and hoping our browser history stays private, this ancient nomad was receiving cosmic instructions that would echo through millennia. So settle in now. Let the day's digital noise fade away. Tonight, we're traveling back 4,000 years to meet a man whose secret life was so extraordinary, so laden with divine encounters and impossible promises, that it makes our modern hidden world seem almost quaint by comparison. Picture this. The year is roughly 2000 BCE. There are no smartphones buzzing with notifications, no social media accounts to maintain, no carefully filtered photos to post. The world moves at the pace of sandaled feet on dusty roads, at the rhythm of camel bells and the gentle lowing of sheep. Cities are small clusters of mud brick buildings, and most people live their entire lives within a day's walk of where they were born. Into this world steps a man named Abram, not yet Abraham. That transformation is still to come. On the surface, he appears to be just another wealthy herdsman, moving his flocks across the ancient landscape. His neighbours see a successful man, certainly. He has servants, livestock, silver and gold. He has a beautiful wife named Sarai. To all outward appearances, he's living the good life that any man of his era might envy. But here's where the story gets fascinating, where Abraham's secret life begins to unfold like a scroll written in starlight. Because while his contemporaries are focused on the practical matters of survival, where to find water for their herds, which trade routes are safe, how to appease the local gods of their various cities, Abraham is hearing something else entirely. He's receiving what can only be described as cosmic phone calls. Now, in our modern world, if someone claimed to be getting direct messages from the Almighty, we'd probably suggest therapy, or at least a social media detox. We're suspicious of anyone who says they've got a hotline to the divine. We live in an age where we can fact-check everything, where we demand proof, where extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But Abraham lived in a time when the boundary between the earthly and the divine was far more permeable. The gods were real, present, active forces in daily life. Every culture had their pantheon, their rituals, their ways of seeking divine favour. Yet what was happening to Abraham was different. This wasn't about appeasing multiple deities or following established religious protocols. This was personal. This was revolutionary. This was secret. The first great secret of Abraham's life came in the form of an impossible instruction. While his neighbors were settling down, establishing roots, building generational wealth in familiar places, Abraham heard a voice telling him to leave everything behind, not just his house or his city, but his entire world. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Imagine receiving that message today. Picture getting a text that says, leave your job, your friends, your family, sell everything you own, and start walking. I'll tell you where to stop. You'd probably block that number and maybe change your locks. But Abraham, carrying the secret conversation with the divine, simply packed up his entire household and started walking. His wife Sarai knew something was happening, certainly. You can't just announce to your spouse that you're liquidating everything and hitting the road without some explanation. But the full weight of what Abraham had heard, the cosmic nature of the promise he'd received, that was his secret to carry. He'd been told he would become the father of nations, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Looking at his aging, childless wife, this must have seemed like either the cruelest joke or the most impossible hope. And so they walked. Abraham, Sarai, their nephew Lot, their servants, their flocks. They walked from the sophisticated city of Ur, with its ziggurats and its trade networks, into the unknown wilderness. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a successful businessman having some sort of midlife crisis. But Abraham was carrying a secret that burned like fire in his chest. He had been chosen for something unprecedented. The journey itself became part of the secret life. Each step was an act of faith in a promise no one else could verify. While other wealthy men of his time were building permanent structures, establishing dynasties rooted in specific locations, Abraham was learning to live as a permanent nomad. His wealth was portable: tents, flocks, servants who could move at a moment's notice. He was building something entirely different, a relationship with the invisible. As they traveled, the secret deepened. At Shechem, at Bethel, at various stopping points along their journey, Abraham would build altars. To his servants, to passing traders, to anyone watching, these might have looked like standard religious observances. Every culture built altars, made sacrifices, sought divine favor, but Abraham's altars were different. They were responses to ongoing conversations, acknowledgements of continued revelations. Each altar was essentially a monument to a secret, a physical marker of an invisible encounter, while others built altars to appease gods they feared or to follow traditions passed down through generations. Abraham was building altars to commemorate personal meetings with the divine. He was establishing a pattern that would define his entire life, the integration of the secret spiritual reality with the visible physical world. The secrets multiplied as the years passed. There was the night when Abraham looked up at the countless stars and heard a voice promising that his descendants would be just as numerous. There was the mysterious encounter with Melchizedek, the priest-king who appeared seemingly out of nowhere with bread and wine, blessed Abraham, and disappeared back into history like a figure from a dream. There were the ongoing conversations about the promised land, about timing, about the future of nations not yet born. But perhaps the most profound secret of Abraham's life was the slow transformation of his understanding of the divine itself. His contemporaries lived in a world of many gods: gods of the storm, gods of the harvest, gods of war, gods tied to specific locations or functions. The religious landscape of his time was crowded with deities who demanded appeasement, who were fickle and tribal and limited. Abraham's secret was his growing relationship with something entirely different, a God who was universal, personal, covenant-making. Not a God who could be bribed with sacrifices or contained within temple walls, but a God who made promises and kept them, who was interested in relationships rather than mere ritual observance. This was revolutionary thinking for its time, a secret so radical it would eventually reshape human understanding of the divine. The weight of carrying such secrets must have been enormous. When you're walking around with cosmic information, when you're living in response to promises others can't hear or verify, the isolation can be profound. Abraham couldn't post about his divine encounters on social media. He couldn't call a friend to process what he'd experienced. He couldn't Google what to do when God calls you to leave everything behind, or find a support group for people receiving prophetic visions. He had to carry these secrets largely alone, trusting in promises that seemed to contradict everything he could see with his natural eyes. Years passed, and still no child came. Decades rolled by, and the promised land remained filled with other peoples, other kingdoms. The gap between the secret promises and the visible reality grew wider and wider. This is where Abraham's secret life becomes most remarkable. While we, in our modern world, struggle to maintain faith in things we can research and verify, Abraham maintained trust in promises that seemed increasingly impossible. His secret life wasn't about hiding shameful behaviors or maintaining a false public image. It was about nurturing hope in the face of apparent impossibility. Consider how this compares to our contemporary understanding of secret lives. We hide our midnight snacking from our fitness trackers. We use incognito mode to research things we're embarrassed about. We maintain different versions of ourselves for different social circles. Our secrets are often about managing perception, about maintaining an image, about avoiding judgment or consequences. Abraham's secrets were about something far more profound. They were about living in response to a reality others couldn't perceive. His hidden life wasn't driven by shame or fear of exposure, but by the overwhelming weight of divine calling. He wasn't trying to hide who he really was. He was trying to become who he'd been called to be. The loneliness of this kind of secret life is almost unimaginable. When everyone around you is living according to visible, practical realities, securing water sources, negotiating trade agreements, managing livestock, planning for predictable seasons, and you're making decisions based on invisible promises and divine conversations, the isolation can be crushing. Abraham lived suspended between two worlds, the world everyone could see and the world only he was experiencing. Yet this secret life wasn't passive. Abraham didn't just receive divine revelations and file them away like spiritual mementos. He acted on them. He restructured his entire existence around these invisible realities. He made decisions that seemed foolish to outside observers, but were perfectly logical within the context of his secret relationship with the divine. When famine struck the promised land and Abraham traveled to Egypt, he carried his secrets with him. When he and Lot had to separate their growing herds and households, Abraham's choice of territory was informed by promises others couldn't hear. When he rescued Lot from the confederation of kings, his confidence in victory came from sources his enemies couldn't calculate. The secret life was reshaping not just Abraham's internal reality, but his external actions, his relationships, his legacy. This wasn't compartmentalized spirituality, a private religious life separate from public behavior. This was integration at the deepest level, allowing the secret conversations with the divine to transform everything visible and practical. And here we must pause and consider the most challenging aspect of Abraham's secret life, the long wait. The promise of descendants came early in his journey, the assurance of land, of blessing, of a great name. These were part of his foundational calling. But the fulfillment? That was decades away. In our instant gratification culture, where we can stream any movie immediately, order food with a tap, and get answers to any question within seconds, the idea of waiting decades for a promise to materialize seems almost cruel. We struggle to wait for a text response, let alone trust in cosmic promises that unfold across generations. Yet Abraham's secret life was largely defined by this patient waiting, not passive waiting, but active trust. He continued to build altars, continued to move in response to divine guidance, continued to make decisions based on promises that remained invisible to everyone around him. His secret life was sustained by hope deferred, but not abandoned. The beauty of Abraham's hidden existence was that it was simultaneously deeply personal and cosmically significant. While our modern secrets tend to be either trivial, like our guilty pleasures and minor embarrassments, or harmful, like deceptions and betrayals, Abraham's secrets were transformative. They were changing him, certainly, but they were also laying the groundwork for changes that would ripple through human history. This is where we must let the story breathe. Let the weight of Abraham's secret life settle into our minds like dust settling on ancient roads. Tomorrow, or in dreams tonight, we'll continue to explore how these hidden divine conversations led to even more extraordinary secrets. A promised child born to parents far beyond childbearing years. A test that would define faith for all future generations, and a legacy that would echo through 3 world religions. For now, let the enormity of Abraham's secret life wash over you like a gentle tide. Close your eyes and imagine the weight of carrying cosmic promises in your heart while your feet navigate ordinary dust and stones. Rest in the knowledge that some secrets are not meant to hide shame, but to nurture hope. Some hidden lives are not about deception, but about transformation. Sleep well, knowing that the greatest secrets in human history were not scandals to be exposed, but promises to be treasured, cultivated, and ultimately fulfilled in ways that exceeded every earthly expectation. The secrets deepened as Abraham's hair grew grey and his steps became more measured. While we in our modern age worry about our digital footprints being discovered decades later, about old photos surfacing at inconvenient moments, Abraham was living with secrets that grew more mysterious with each passing year. The divine promises he carried weren't becoming clearer with time, they were becoming more impossible. Picture yourself maintaining hope in something that seems increasingly unlikely. In our world, we might keep refreshing our email for that job offer, or checking our bank account for that promised payment, or waiting for test results that will change everything. But imagine waiting not days or weeks, but decades. Imagine your secret hope becoming the whispered joke of your community, the thing people politely don't mention when they see you, because that's exactly what happened to Abraham and Sarah. Their secret, the promise of a child, of descendants numberless as stars, had become the elephant in the tent. Sarah was now well past the age when women bear children. In a world without modern medicine, without fertility treatments, without any of the interventions we might consider today, her barrenness wasn't just disappointing, it was final. Yet Abraham continued to carry this secret like a flame cupped in his hands against the wind. Every month that passed without conception, every year that added lines to their faces, every whispered conversation between servants about the childless master, all of it was evidence against the promise he held in his heart. But here's what made Abraham's secret life so extraordinary. Doubt didn't extinguish the flame. It only made him guard it more carefully. In our contemporary world, we've become experts at managing disappointment. We have backup plans for our backup plans. We hedge our bets, diversify our investments, keep multiple options open. We've learned not to put all our eggs in one basket, not to count our chickens before they hatch. We're pragmatic, realistic, prepared for various outcomes. Abraham had placed everything, his entire identity, his legacy, his understanding of divine purpose, into one impossible basket. And as the years stretched on, as the promise seemed to mock their advancing age, he didn't hedge. He didn't develop contingency plans. He simply continued to believe in a secret that the visible world contradicted daily. This is where Abraham's hidden life becomes almost alien to our modern sensibilities. We live in an age of evidence-based decision-making, where we want data to support our choices, reviews to validate our purchases, testimonials to confirm our hopes. Abraham was operating on pure faith in conversations others couldn't verify, promises others couldn't corroborate, a relationship others couldn't measure or quantify. The strain of this secret life began to show in ways that feel remarkably human. Sarah, carrying her own version of this impossible hope, eventually reached her breaking point. She looked at her aging body, at the biological impossibility of their situation, and she did what any practical woman might do. She tried to solve the problem herself. Enter Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant. In a move that seems shocking by our modern standards but was perfectly legal and socially acceptable in their time, Sarah essentially offered Hagar as a surrogate. If the promise of descendants was going to be fulfilled, perhaps it needed some human assistance. Perhaps the secret divine plan required practical human intervention. But here's where Abraham's secret life collided painfully with earthly reality. When Hagar conceived and bore Ishmael, it should have been a moment of triumph, a fulfillment of the long-held promise. Instead, it created a household tension that would echo through generations. Sarah, who had orchestrated this solution, now found herself jealous of her servant. Hagar, suddenly the mother of her master's heir, grew proud and difficult. Abraham found himself caught between the women, between competing interpretations of divine will. The birth of Ishmael actually complicated Abraham's secret life rather than resolving it. Because now there was a child, yes, but was this the promised child? Had the divine promise been fulfilled through human scheming, or was there still more to come? The secret conversations with the divine continued, but they were now layered with new questions, new uncertainties, new family dynamics that made the hidden spiritual reality even more complex. In our modern context, we might compare this to trying to force a relationship because an app told us we were compatible, or accepting a job that wasn't quite right because we were tired of waiting for the perfect opportunity. Sometimes our attempts to help divine timing along create more complications than clarity. Abraham's secret life during this period must have been particularly challenging. He now had a son, but the promise felt incomplete. He had descendants, but not in the way he'd expected. He had answered prayers, but they came wrapped in family drama that made his household feel more like a reality TV show than a blessed family. Then came perhaps the most extraordinary secret of Abraham's entire life. When he was 99 years old, an age when most people in our time are considering assisted living facilities and medication management, Abraham received another divine visitation. But this wasn't just a conversation or a promise. This was a covenant ceremony that would have seemed bizarre to any outside observer. Picture this scene. A nearly century-old man performing a surgical procedure on himself that was completely unknown in his culture. Circumcision wasn't a religious practice among his people. There was no cultural context for what he was doing, no tradition to explain it, no community to support it. To anyone watching, Abraham's actions would have seemed like the bizarre behavior of an elderly man losing his grip on reality. But for Abraham, this was the ultimate integration of his secret spiritual life with his physical reality. The covenant wasn't just a promise he held in his heart anymore. It was now written on his body. The secret had become literally incarnate, carved into flesh that would heal and remain as a permanent reminder of divine promises. This is where Abraham's secret life transcends anything we might understand in our modern context. Our hidden lives are typically about information we don't want others to know. Abraham's secret life had become a physical reality that transformed his very body. The covenant wasn't just something he believed, it was something he bore in his flesh. Along with this covenant came new names. Abram became Abraham, father of many nations. Sarai became Sarah, princess. These weren't just cosmetic changes or personal rebranding exercises like updating your social media handle. These were prophetic declarations, spoken into existence before the reality they described had manifested. Abraham was walking around with a name that proclaimed promises not yet fulfilled. introducing himself with declarations that must have seemed either presumptuous or delusional to anyone who knew his circumstances. Imagine updating your LinkedIn profile to reflect a promotion you haven't received yet, or changing your relationship status to married while you're still single. That's essentially what Abraham was doing, but on a cosmic scale. His very identity was now aligned with secrets others couldn't understand. The most remarkable secret was still to come. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, when their bodies were, as the text bluntly states, as good as dead for reproductive purposes, Sarah conceived and bore Isaac, the child of promise, the son of laughter, the miraculous fulfillment of decades of secret hope. But even this joy came wrapped in complexity. The birth of Isaac intensified the household tensions with Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah, now the mother of the promised child, insisted that the servant and her son be sent away. Abraham found himself having to make an agonizing choice between his two sons, between competing claims on his affection and his legacy. In our modern world, we have family counselors, mediation services, legal frameworks for complex family situations. Abraham had only his secret conversations with the divine to guide him through this heartbreak. The God who had promised descendants through Sarah now instructed Abraham to let Hagar and Ishmael go, but with the assurance that Ishmael too would become the father of nations. This decision reveals another layer of Abraham's secret life, the cost of divine calling. The promises he carried weren't just blessings, they came with prices that cut to the very heart of human attachment. His secret life with God required sacrifices that went far beyond ritual offerings. It demanded choices that no human heart wants to make. The complexity of Abraham's secret life during this period is almost overwhelming to consider. He was simultaneously the father of the promised child and the man who had to send away another son. He was the recipient of miraculous provision and the agent of heartbreaking separation. He was living proof of divine faithfulness and a participant in family pain that would echo through generations. Yet through all of this, Abraham maintained his hidden life of divine relationship. The altars continued to be built. The conversations with God continued. The trust in promises not yet fully realized remained intact. His secret life wasn't compartmentalized from these human complexities. It was the lens through which he navigated them. As Isaac grew from a miraculous infant into a young man, Abraham's secret life must have seemed to be reaching its fulfillment. The impossible child was thriving. The promise of descendants was no longer abstract. It was walking around the camp, learning to tend flocks, growing into the future that had been promised so long ago. The secret hope had become visible reality. But the God of Abraham's secret life had one more test in mind, one more secret to share that would challenge everything Abraham thought he understood about divine purpose and human sacrifice. The instruction, when it came, would make every previous secret pale by comparison. It would ask Abraham to take the very fulfillment of the promise and offer it back to the one who had given it. Rest now in the knowledge that secrets can be sacred, that hidden lives can be holy, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be lived. Let your breathing slow like the gentle rhythm of ancient footsteps on desert paths, walking forward into promises not yet seen, carrying hope like treasure in earthen vessels. The story continues, but for now, let the weight of Abraham's extraordinary secret life settle into your consciousness like starlight on sand. In a world where we hide our browser histories and carefully curate our online presence, here was a man whose secret life was a conversation with eternity itself, whose hidden reality was more substantial than anything visible to mortal eyes. Sleep well, dear listener, knowing that the most profound secrets are not scandals to be exposed, but sacred truths to be treasured in the quiet chambers of the heart. The morning came like any other morning in Abraham's camp. The servants moved through their familiar routines, tending fires, milking goats, preparing the simple meal that would sustain them through another day. Isaac, now a young man with his father's thoughtful eyes and his mother's quick smile, helped with the daily tasks that kept their nomadic household functioning. To any observer, it was the picture of a blessed family settling into the rhythms of ordinary life. But Abraham carried a new secret, one so terrible and incomprehensible that it made all his previous divine encounters seem like gentle whispers compared to thunder. The voice had come in the night, as it often did, but this time the familiar comfort of divine presence was replaced by something that felt like a sword thrust through his heart. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. In our modern world, we have words for this kind of instruction. We have psychiatric evaluations, intervention protocols, emergency hotlines. If someone today claimed to hear voices telling them to harm their child, we would immediately recognize this as a mental health crisis requiring immediate professional intervention. We have safeguards, support systems, medical understanding of psychological breaks from reality. But Abraham lived in a world where divine communication was expected, where sacrifice was a normal part of religious life, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were fluid. Yet even in his ancient context, this instruction was beyond comprehension. Child sacrifice existed among some neighboring peoples, yes, but it was an abomination, a practice that marked the difference between civilized and barbaric cultures. The secret Abraham now carried was more than impossible. It was monstrous. Everything he had learned about the character of the God who had called him, everything he understood about the promises that had shaped his life, everything he believed about divine goodness seemed to contradict this horrific command. The God who had given him this miraculous son was now demanding that same son as a sacrifice. Imagine carrying that secret through the ordinary moments of the next few days, watching Isaac help with the flocks, listening to Sarah hum as she prepared meals, engaging in the small conversations that make up family life, all while knowing that you've been instructed to end it all. The weight of such knowledge would be crushing in ways we can barely comprehend. Our modern secrets pale in comparison. We worry about someone discovering our streaming passwords, our search histories, our private conversations. We stress about maintaining our carefully constructed online personas, about managing the gap between who we appear to be and who we really are. But Abraham was carrying a secret that threatened to destroy not just his reputation, but his very soul. The psychological torture of those days must have been unimaginable. Every time Isaac smiled at him, every casual conversation about the future, every moment of paternal pride became a source of agony. How do you look at your beloved child, the child you waited decades to hold, the child who represents every promise you've ever believed, and know that you've been asked to kill him? In our therapeutic age, we might say that Abraham was experiencing a complete crisis of faith, a psychological break, a collapse of his belief system. We would expect denial, bargaining, anger, depression, all the stages of grief playing out as he processed this impossible command. We would expect him to question everything, his sanity, his relationship with the divine, the very foundations of moral reality. But Abraham's response reveals the most extraordinary aspect of his secret life. He didn't argue, he didn't bargain, he didn't seek second opinions or look for loopholes. The text simply says that early the next morning, he got up and prepared for the journey. He saddled his donkey, gathered wood for the offering, and set out with Isaac and 2 servants toward the mountains of Moriah. This acceptance isn't passive resignation or mindless obedience. It's something far more complex and terrifying. It's trust that has been purified by decades of divine relationship. Abraham had learned, through years of carrying impossible secrets, that the God who made promises was also the God who kept them, even when the path toward fulfillment was incomprehensible. Think about how we handle uncertainty in our modern lives. We research everything extensively before making decisions. We read reviews, check ratings, consult experts, get multiple opinions. We want to understand the risks, the benefits, the likely outcomes. We make pro and con lists, run cost-benefit analyses, seek advice from friends and family. The idea of moving forward without understanding the full picture feels reckless and irresponsible. Abraham was walking toward a mountain with the full intention of killing his son, and his only guidance was a secret conversation with a God whose logic had become completely opaque. This wasn't reckless faith. It was faith that had been tested by decades of impossible circumstances and had somehow emerged stronger and more refined. The 3-day journey to Moriah must have felt like walking through a nightmare. Every step took him closer to an act that violated everything he understood about right and wrong, about parental love, about the nature of divine blessing. His companions, Isaac and the 2 servants, chatted and walked beside him, completely unaware that they were accompanying a man toward what appeared to be the complete destruction of everything he held dear. Consider the conversations during those 3 days. Isaac, walking beside his father, perhaps asking about their destination, wondering about the purpose of their journey, excited to participate in what seemed like an important religious ceremony. Abraham, responding with words that must have felt like ash in his mouth, maintaining the facade of normalcy while his heart was being torn apart by the secret he carried. In our world of constant communication, we can hardly imagine carrying such a burden alone. We text our worries to friends, post vague messages on social media when we're struggling, seek validation and support from our networks. We process our anxieties through conversations, through sharing, through the comfort of knowing others understand our struggles. Abraham walked those dusty roads with a secret so terrible that sharing it would have only multiplied the agony. Sarah didn't know. Isaac didn't know. The servants didn't know. He was completely alone with the most horrific knowledge imaginable, trusting in a divine plan that seemed to have become malevolent. On the 3rd day, when they could see the mountain in the distance, Abraham made a decision that reveals yet another layer of his extraordinary secret life. He told the servants to wait with the donkey while he and Isaac went up the mountain to worship. Then he said something remarkable. "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." We, both of us. This wasn't just a comforting lie told to protect the servants from knowledge they couldn't handle. This was Abraham speaking a hope he couldn't explain, expressing a faith that defied all rational analysis. Even as he prepared to carry out the terrible command, some part of his secret life with God was telling him that this story wouldn't end in death. In our modern context, we might call this denial or delusion. How can you simultaneously prepare to kill your child and expect to return together? How can you hold both realities in your mind without breaking completely? But Abraham had learned, through decades of carrying impossible secrets, to trust in divine faithfulness, even when divine logic was completely hidden from view. As they climbed the mountain together, Isaac carrying the wood that would become his pyre, Abraham carrying the fire and the knife, the young man asked the question that must have nearly broken his father's heart. The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham's answer reveals the depth of his secret life. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. This wasn't deflection or deception. This was prophecy spoken from a heart that trusted in divine provision, even while preparing for divine devastation. Abraham was simultaneously acting on the terrible command and believing in a rescue he couldn't see or understand. Think about the complexity of that moment. In our world, we struggle to hold even simple contradictions in our minds. We want clear answers, straightforward paths, outcomes we can predict and control. Abraham was walking forward in perfect obedience to a command that contradicted everything else he believed about God, while simultaneously maintaining hope in a resolution he couldn't imagine. When they reached the place, Abraham built the altar with hands that must have trembled. He arranged the wood with the careful precision of decades of sacrifice. But this time the offering would be his own heart, walking beside him. He bound Isaac, and here the text is mercifully brief, not dwelling on what that conversation must have entailed, what explanations must have been offered, what trust must have been asked and given. Picture that moment when understanding dawned in Isaac's eyes, when the young man realized that he was not just a participant in this sacrifice, but its object. Our modern sensibilities recoil from the scene. We think of trauma, of betrayal, of psychological damage that would require years of therapy to heal. We think of trust broken, of relationships destroyed, of faith shattered. But Isaac, raised in the atmosphere of Abraham's secret life with God, somehow understood that this was bigger than either of them could comprehend. He submitted to being bound, laid on the altar, positioned as an offering. He participated in his own near sacrifice with a trust that mirrors his father's lifetime of impossible faith. Abraham raised the knife. In that moment, decades of secret divine relationship culminated in the most terrible test imaginable. Everything he had believed, everything he had hoped, everything he had built his life upon was balanced on the edge of a blade. The son of promise, the child of laughter, the living embodiment of divine faithfulness was about to be offered back to the one who had given him. And then, in the split second before the blade fell, when Abraham had demonstrated beyond all doubt that his secret life with God was more precious to him than even his most beloved child, a voice called out from heaven, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." The relief that must have flooded through Abraham's body, the trembling that must have followed the adrenaline, the tears that must have mingled with laughter as he untied his son and held him close. These human responses to divine rescue are almost too intimate to contemplate. The secret that had threatened to destroy everything had been transformed into the secret of ultimate provision. Looking up, Abraham saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. The substitute offering, the divine provision, the answer to his prophetic words to Isaac. God himself will provide the lamb. The secret life had culminated not in tragedy, but in revelation, a glimpse into the heart of a God who tests but does not destroy, who asks for everything but provides what is needed. As father and son walked down the mountain together, their relationship had been transformed by the shared experience of ultimate trust and divine rescue. Isaac now carried his own secret knowledge of what it meant to be offered and redeemed, to be bound and freed, to face death and find life. The secret life that had defined Abraham's existence had now become a family inheritance. The servants waited where they had been left, unaware that they had witnessed from a distance one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of faith in human history. To them, it had been an ordinary religious observance, a father and son going up to worship and returning as promised. But Abraham and Isaac descended carrying secrets that would echo through generations. In our modern world, where we're accustomed to happy endings and therapeutic resolutions, we might expect this story to conclude with perfect understanding, with all mysteries revealed and all questions answered. But Abraham's secret life wasn't about achieving clarity. It was about learning to trust in the midst of incomprehension. The God who had called him from Ur, who had promised descendants and land, who had provided a son in old age, had now revealed something even deeper. That the ultimate test of relationship isn't understanding, but surrender. Abraham's secret life had been preparing him for this moment when he would have to choose between the gift and the giver, between the promise and the promise maker. As they made their way home, as the ordinary rhythms of nomadic life resumed, Abraham carried yet another secret, the knowledge of what divine testing could demand and what divine faithfulness would provide. He had learned that the God of his secret conversations was capable of asking for anything and everything, but was also committed to providing exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. Sleep now, dear listener, and let the weight of Abraham's extraordinary secret life settle into your dreams like incense rising from ancient altars. In a world where our hidden lives are often about shame or fear, here was a man whose secret life was about trust refined by fire, faith tested by impossibility, and love that chose surrender over understanding. Tomorrow, in dreams or in waking, we'll discover how these secrets became the foundation stones of faith for billions who would follow, how one man's hidden life with the divine became the template for relationship with the eternal. But for now, rest in the knowledge that some secrets are too sacred for casual sharing, too precious for public display, too profound for anything but quiet trust in the darkness. The journey home from Mount Moriah was unlike any other in Abraham's long life of wandering. Where once he had traveled carrying the weight of unfulfilled promises, now he walked with the knowledge of what divine testing truly meant. The secret he now bore wasn't about future hope deferred, but about present reality transformed. Every step away from that mountain altar carried him deeper into a mystery he would spend the rest of his days contemplating. In our modern age, we document everything. We take photos of our meals, record videos of our children's first steps, live stream our experiences for friends to witness in real time. We have an almost compulsive need to capture and share significant moments, to make our private experiences public, to seek validation through collective witnessing of our lives. But Abraham walked home from the most significant moment of his existence with no record except what was written on his heart. No photographs of the ram caught in the thicket, no video of Isaac's face when the knife was stayed, no social media post about divine provision. Just the quiet, profound secret of a God who asks for everything and provides exactly what is needed at precisely the right moment. The silence of that return journey must have been profound. Isaac, now carrying his own impossible secret of being offered and redeemed, walked beside his father with new understanding of what it meant to be part of a divine plan larger than individual comprehension. They had shared something that transcended ordinary father-son experience, something that bound them together in ways that words could never adequately express. Consider how different this is from our contemporary approach to significant experiences. We process trauma through therapy, work through difficult relationships with counselors, seek support groups for extraordinary circumstances. We have entire industries built around helping people integrate challenging experiences into their ongoing narratives. We believe in talking things through, in sharing our burdens, in collective healing. Abraham and Isaac walked in companionable silence, each processing the magnitude of what they had experienced through the lens of their secret life with the divine. The testing hadn't broken their relationship. It had revealed its ultimate foundation. They had learned together that their bond with each other was precious, but their bond with the eternal was primary. When they finally reached Sarah's tent, when the ordinary rhythms of family life resumed around them, Abraham faced a new kind of secret-keeping. How do you explain to your wife that you took her miracle child, her son of promise, her joy born in old age, and prepared to sacrifice him on a mountain altar? How do you share that kind of experience without traumatizing the one person who had waited longest for the blessing you nearly offered back to God? In our world of radical transparency, where we're encouraged to share everything with our spouses, where healthy relationships are built on complete honesty and open communication, Abraham's choice to protect Sarah from the full weight of what had happened might seem deceptive. But his secret wasn't about hiding failure or avoiding consequences. It was about bearing a burden too heavy for anyone else to carry. Sarah had her own secret life with the divine, her own journey of impossible hope fulfilled, her own relationship with the God who had opened her barren womb. But the testing on Mount Moriah had been specifically for Abraham and Isaac, a father-son revelation that didn't require her participation to be complete. Some divine encounters, Abraham had learned were meant to be held quietly in the heart, rather than dissected through discussion. The servants who had waited at the foot of the mountain returned to their duties none the wiser about what had transpired in their absence. To them, it had been an ordinary religious pilgrimage, the kind of spiritual observance they had witnessed countless times throughout their years of service. They had seen Abraham build altars before, had watched him perform sacrifices, had grown accustomed to their master's devotional practices. This highlights another dimension of Abraham's secret life that seems almost impossible by our modern standards. In an age where privacy is constantly under assault, where security cameras record our public movements and digital footprints track our online behavior, where gossip travels at the speed of social media, Abraham maintained profound privacy around the most significant moments of his spiritual journey. His household servants lived in intimate proximity to his daily life. They witnessed his conversations with Sarah, observed his decision-making processes, were present for the routine activities that filled his days. Yet somehow, he maintained the sacred boundaries around his divine encounters, protecting the holiness of those experiences from casual observation or discussion. The secret life wasn't about deception, it was about reverence. Abraham understood intuitively that some experiences with the divine were too sacred for ordinary conversation, too profound for casual sharing, too precious to risk diminishing through inadequate words. His silence wasn't about shame or fear, but about protecting the mystery that had become the center of his existence. As months passed after the Mount Moriah experience, Abraham's secret life entered a new phase. The testing was complete, but the relationship continued. The God who had asked for his most precious gift had proven trustworthy in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Now Abraham carried the secret knowledge of what divine faithfulness looked like when pushed to its absolute limits. This transformed his daily interactions in subtle but profound ways. When neighbors complained about difficult circumstances, when fellow nomads worried about uncertain futures, when the ordinary anxieties of desert life pressed in around them, Abraham carried the quiet confidence of someone who had seen divine provision manifest at the moment of greatest need. He didn't preach about it, didn't use his experience to lecture others about faith, didn't turn his testing into a teaching opportunity for those around him. The secret remained sacred, protected, held close to his heart, like a treasure too valuable to display casually. But its presence shaped everything else about how he moved through the world. In our therapeutic culture, we might criticize this approach as emotionally unhealthy, as failing to process trauma adequately, as missing opportunities for growth through sharing and vulnerability. We believe in the healing power of storytelling, in the importance of bearing witness to each other's experiences, in the community support that comes through honest disclosure of our struggles. But Abraham's silence wasn't about avoiding healing. It was about protecting holiness. He understood that some encounters with the divine were meant to be treasured rather than analyzed, contemplated rather than explained, held rather than shared. His secret life had taught him the difference between experiences that needed community support and experiences that required individual stewardship. The ordinary details of life continued around this extraordinary secret. Flocks needed tending. Business required attention. Household management demanded Abraham's practical involvement. But now these mundane activities were infused with deeper meaning. Every decision was made by someone who had learned what ultimate surrender looked like. Every challenge was met by someone who had experienced divine provision at the point of greatest extremity. Sarah, observing her husband in the months following their return from Moriah, must have noticed subtle changes. Perhaps a deeper peace in his demeanor, a more profound settledness in his spirit, a quieter confidence in the face of uncertainty. She had lived with Abraham long enough to read the signs of his inner life, to recognize when divine encounters had marked him in new ways. But if she asked direct questions about what had happened during those days away, Abraham's responses would have been gentle but protective, not because he didn't trust her with the truth, but because he recognized that some truths are too weighty for ordinary conversation, too sacred for casual discussion, too precious to risk diminishing through inadequate explanation. Isaac, now carrying his own version of the secret, developed a new understanding of what it meant to be part of God's plan for the future. He had experienced firsthand what divine testing could require and what divine faithfulness could provide. This knowledge would shape his own secret life as he matured, his own relationship with the God of his fathers, his own understanding of what it meant to be chosen for purposes larger than individual comfort or preference. The bond between father and son, already strong, was now forged in the fire of shared testing and mutual trust. They had a secret language of glances and gestures, an understanding that transcended words, a connection built on having faced the ultimate question together and emerged with their faith intact. Years passed, and Abraham's hair grew whiter, his steps more careful, his voice softer with age. But the secret from Mount Moriah remained as fresh and present as if it had happened yesterday. Some experiences with the divine, he had learned, don't fade with time. They deepen, revealing new layers of meaning as the years accumulate wisdom and perspective. When visitors came to Abraham's camp, when traveling merchants stopped to trade or seek hospitality, when neighboring tribes sent representatives to negotiate grazing rights or water access, they encountered a man whose reputation for wisdom and fairness had spread throughout the region. But they had no idea that his insight came from carrying secrets too profound for ordinary sharing. The hospitality for which Abraham became famous wasn't just cultural courtesy or shrewd diplomacy, it was the overflow of a heart that had experienced divine generosity at the moment of greatest need. Having been provided for when provision seemed impossible, he extended provision to others as naturally as breathing. His reputation as a just mediator, as someone whose counsel was sought in disputes and difficulties, wasn't based on formal education or inherited status. It was the practical result of a secret life that had been tested and refined by direct encounter with divine justice and mercy. The wealth that continued to accumulate around Abraham's household, the prosperity that marked his herds and holdings, wasn't just the result of shrewd business practices or fortunate circumstances. It was the tangible manifestation of promises spoken in secret conversations with the divine, blessings that flowed from relationship rather than mere transaction. But Abraham never confused the blessings with the blessing giver. The testing on Mount Moriah had burned away any possibility of treating divine gifts as ends in themselves rather than expressions of divine relationship. His secret life had taught him the difference between enjoying God's gifts and worshipping them, between grateful stewardship and possessive ownership. As he moved through his final years, Abraham's secret life took on a different quality. The urgent questions of earlier decades, will the promises be fulfilled? Will descendants come? Will the land be given? Had been replaced by deeper mysteries about divine timing, divine purpose, divine methods that transcended human understanding. He had learned to live comfortably with questions that had no immediate answers, to trust in promises whose fulfillment might extend far beyond his own lifespan, to participate in plans whose scope exceeded individual comprehension. His secret life had evolved from seeking specific outcomes to embracing relationship with the God who orchestrated outcomes according to wisdom far greater than human calculation. The quiet confidence this produced was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Abraham's later years. In a world where uncertainty bred anxiety, where unknown futures generated fear, where uncontrollable circumstances produced desperation, Abraham moved with the calm assurance of someone who had learned to distinguish between his responsibilities and God's responsibilities. He was responsible for faithfulness, for obedience, for maintaining relationship with the divine. God was responsible for outcomes, for timing, for methods, for the ultimate fulfillment of promises made in secret conversations across decades of walking together through an uncertain world. This division of labor, learned through years of carrying impossible secrets and witnessing their surprising fulfillment, freed Abraham from the exhausting burden of trying to control results he was never meant to manage. His secret life had taught him the peace that comes from doing his part and trusting God to do the rest. As evening shadows lengthened across the ancient landscape, as another day of ordinary activities gave way to the quiet contemplation of night, Abraham would often sit outside his tent and look up at the stars that had once represented an impossible promise. Now they served as a reminder of faithfulness kept, of secrets revealed in God's perfect timing, of a life lived in conversation with eternity itself. Rest now, dear friend, and let the profound mysteries of Abraham's secret life settle into your consciousness like starlight on still water. In our age of constant connectivity and compulsive sharing, here was a man who understood the sacred value of silence, the holy necessity of protecting some experiences from casual exposure, the deep wisdom of treasuring divine encounters in the secret chambers of the heart. Tomorrow, or in the quiet spaces of sleep, we'll explore how Abraham's secret life became a template for all who would follow, how his hidden conversations with the divine established patterns of faith that would echo through generations. But for now, let the weight of his extraordinary trust rest gently on your spirit, reminding you that some secrets are too sacred for words, too precious for publicity, too profound for anything but quiet gratitude in the darkness. Sleep well, knowing that the most significant conversations in human history often happen in whispers, that the most important relationships are cultivated in silence, that the most transformative secrets are held not in smartphones or servers, but in hearts surrendered to mysteries larger than understanding, deeper than explanation, more enduring than time itself. The secret conversations didn't end with Mount Moriah. If anything, they deepened, took on new dimensions, became more intimate in ways that would have been impossible before that mountain altar. Abraham had learned something about the divine character that could only be learned through testing so severe it stripped away every earthly attachment and revealed the bedrock of relationship itself. In our modern world, we think we understand what it means to have a deep relationship with someone. We text throughout the day, share photos of our meals, post about our feelings, update each other on every minor detail of our lives. We equate intimacy with constant communication, closeness with complete transparency. We measure relationship by frequency of contact and volume of shared information. But Abraham's secret life with the divine operated on entirely different principles. The conversations weren't daily downloads of trivial updates. They weren't casual check-ins or routine maintenance of connection. They were encounters so profound, so transformative, that each one could sustain faith for years of silence between revelations. Picture the weight of living with such spaced out but monumentally significant communications. Imagine receiving a text message that changes the trajectory of your entire existence, then waiting months or years for the next one. Not because the relationship has grown cold, but because the previous message contained enough meaning to fuel a lifetime of contemplation and response. This is what made Abraham's secret life so radically different from our contemporary understanding of hidden relationships. We hide things from others that we're ashamed of, embarrassed about, or fear might damage our reputation. We maintain private conversations that are often either trivial or problematic. Our secret communications are typically about managing image, avoiding consequences, or indulging in behaviors we don't want others to know about. Abraham's secret life was the opposite of shame-based hiding. It was reverence-based protection. He guarded his divine encounters not because they were embarrassing or inappropriate, but because they were too sacred for casual consumption, too profound for ordinary conversation, too precious to risk diminishing through inadequate explanation. Consider how this played out in his daily interactions with Sarah. She had been his companion through decades of impossible journeys, the co-bearer of promises that defied biological reality, the woman who had laughed at divine announcements and then held the fulfillment of those announcements in her aging arms. Yet even with her, Abraham maintained protective boundaries around the deepest mysteries of his spiritual experience. This wasn't about excluding Sarah from his relationship with God. She had her own encounters, her own direct experiences with divine intervention. The angel who announced Isaac's birth had spoken to her directly. The laughter that earned their son his name had come from her throat. She wasn't a passive recipient of second-hand spiritual information. She was a full participant in the unfolding divine plan. But Abraham understood something profound about the nature of divine relationship that we struggle to grasp in our age of radical transparency. Some encounters with the eternal are meant to be held individually, treasured personally, protected from the well-meaning but potentially diminishing commentary of even our closest companions, not because sharing would be wrong, but because some experiences lose their transformative power when subjected to analysis and discussion. In our therapeutic culture, this might seem emotionally unhealthy. We're trained to believe that processing difficult experiences requires community support, that healing happens through sharing, that secrets are generally problematic for relationships. We encourage people to talk it out, to seek counseling, to find support groups where they can process their experiences with others who understand. But Abraham's silence wasn't about avoiding healing. It was about protecting mystery. He had learned that some divine encounters were meant to be contemplated rather than analyzed, treasured rather than dissected, held rather than shared. His secret life had taught him the difference between experiences that needed community processing and experiences that required individual stewardship. The years following Mount Moriah brought a different kind of secret to Abraham's life. Where once he had carried the burden of unfulfilled promises, now he bore the weight of promises kept in ways that exceeded every human expectation. The God who had asked for his most precious gift had proven trustworthy in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Now Abraham carried the quiet knowledge of what divine faithfulness looked like when pushed to its absolute limits. This transformed his relationship with uncertainty in profound ways. When desert storms threatened his herds, when tribal conflicts disrupted trade routes, when the ordinary anxieties of nomadic life pressed in around him, Abraham faced these challenges with the calm confidence of someone who had learned what divine provision looked like at the moment of greatest extremity. He didn't become reckless or presumptuous. He still took practical precautions, still made wise decisions about grazing areas and water sources, still negotiated carefully with neighboring tribes. But his approach to these practical matters was fundamentally different from his contemporaries, because it was informed by secrets they couldn't access or understand. While others relied solely on visible resources and predictable patterns, Abraham operated with additional information. Not because he received daily divine updates about weather patterns and political developments, but because his secret life had taught him to recognize the difference between circumstances he could control and outcomes that were ultimately in divine hands. This produced a quality of leadership that others found both attractive and mysterious. Tribal leaders sought his counsel not because of his formal education or inherited status, but because of a wisdom that seemed to come from sources they couldn't identify. His advice was practical yet profound, his judgment fair yet merciful, his decisions shrewd yet generous. What they didn't understand was that Abraham's counsel was filtered through decades of secret conversations with the divine. His wisdom wasn't the product of superior intelligence or extensive experience. It was the overflow of a heart that had been shaped by ongoing relationship with eternal perspectives on temporal problems. The hospitality for which Abraham became famous throughout the region wasn't just cultural courtesy or strategic relationship building. It was the practical expression of a secret life that had been marked by divine generosity at moments of greatest need. Having experienced provision when provision seemed impossible, he extended provision to others as naturally as breathing. When travelers appeared at his tent, when strangers sought shelter from desert storms, when representatives from distant tribes arrived to negotiate agreements, they encountered generosity that exceeded cultural expectations. But they had no way of knowing that Abraham's open-handed welcome was rooted in secrets too sacred for casual sharing. The 3 visitors who appeared at his tent one scorching afternoon seemed like ordinary travelers seeking rest and refreshment. Abraham's immediate response, running to meet them, bowing to the ground, urgently preparing an elaborate feast, might have appeared to observers as either excessive hospitality or shrewd diplomacy with potentially important guests. But Abraham recognized something in these visitors that others would have missed. His secret life with the divine had attuned him to recognize divine presence, even when it came disguised in ordinary human form. The conversations that followed weren't casual dinner table chat between host and guests. They were the continuation of a lifelong dialogue between Abraham and his God. When the visitors announced that Sarah would bear a child within the year, her laughter from inside the tent wasn't just the response of an elderly woman to an impossible prediction. It was an echo of the laughter that had marked her entire journey of faith. She had learned, through her own secret encounters with divine timing, to find humor in the gap between human impossibility and divine inevitability. The conversation that followed, as Abraham walked part way with his departing guests, revealed another dimension of his secret life. The divine visitors didn't just share pleasant predictions about family expansion, they disclosed their intentions regarding Sodom and Gomorrah. Once again, Abraham was being brought into confidence about divine plans that would reshape the landscape of his world. But this time, the secret came with an invitation to participate. The God who had tested Abraham's willingness to surrender his most precious gift now invited him to intercede for the preservation of cities marked for destruction. The man who had learned to trust divine justice, even when it demanded personal sacrifice, was now invited to appeal to divine mercy on behalf of others. The negotiation that followed, Abraham bargaining down from 50 righteous people to 10 as the minimum number required to spare the cities, wasn't presumptuous haggling with the Almighty. It was the natural conversation between 2 parties who had established deep trust through years of relationship building. Abraham's boldness in intercession grew directly from his secret knowledge of divine character revealed through personal testing. When the cities were ultimately destroyed despite his intercession, Abraham didn't interpret this as divine cruelty or failed negotiation. His secret life had taught him that divine mercy and divine justice operate according to wisdom far beyond human calculation. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't evidence of divine failure. It was confirmation that some forms of corruption exceed the possibility of redemption. The rescue of Lot and his family from the doomed cities added another layer to Abraham's secret life. His nephew's salvation wasn't just the result of family loyalty or divine favoritism. It was the fulfillment of promises made in secret conversations years earlier. Abraham had learned that divine faithfulness extends not just to primary covenant holders, but to those connected to them through relationship and intercession. As Abraham aged, his secret life took on the quality of legacy preparation. The promises he had carried for decades were beginning to take shape in ways that would extend far beyond his own lifespan. Isaac was now a grown man, ready to carry forward the covenant relationship that had defined Abraham's existence. But how do you pass on a secret life? How do you transfer relationship that has been built through personal encounter? The answer, Abraham discovered, wasn't through detailed explanation or systematic teaching. Divine relationship couldn't be inherited like property or learned like a skill. Each person had to develop their own secret life with God, their own pattern of encounter and response, their own history of promise and fulfillment. But what Abraham could pass on was the framework for relationship, the expectation of divine encounter, the confidence that the God who had spoken to him would continue speaking to those who followed in the covenant line. His secret life became the foundation for Isaac's secret life, not through direct transfer, but through modeling what it looked like to live in ongoing conversation with the Eternal. The death of Sarah marked a profound transition in Abraham's secret life. The woman who had shared his journey from Ur to Canaan, who had waited with him through decades of barrenness, who had laughed at divine promises and then held their fulfillment in her arms, was gone. Part of Abraham's earthly story was complete, but the secret conversations with the divine continued. Purchasing the cave of Machpelah for Sarah's burial wasn't just a practical transaction. It was Abraham's first legal claim to the Promised Land. After decades of living as a nomad in territory promised but not yet possessed, he was finally establishing permanent presence through the most permanent of human acts: burial of the dead. The negotiation with the Hittites, conducted in full public view at the city gate, contrasted sharply with the secret conversations that had brought Abraham to this moment. Where his relationship with the divine had been intensely personal and largely hidden, his acquisition of burial ground was deliberately public and legally documented. The secret life was beginning to take visible, verifiable form. As Abraham contemplated his own approaching death, his secret life evolved into something resembling a gentle completion. The urgent questions of earlier decades had been answered. The impossible promises had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded his wildest expectations. The tests had been passed, the relationship established, the covenant confirmed through multiple generations. But even in these final years, the secret conversations continued. Not with the urgency of earlier encounters, not with the drama of crisis and testing, but with the quiet intimacy of old friends who had walked many roads together. Abraham's secret life had matured into something resembling divine friendship. A relationship so deep, so tested, so proven that words were often unnecessary. The servant sent to find a wife for Isaac carried with him not just material gifts and practical instructions, but something of Abraham's secret confidence in divine guidance. The old man's assurance that God would provide the right woman at the right time wasn't based on careful planning or strategic networking. It was rooted in decades of witnessing divine provision in circumstances far more impossible than matchmaking. When Rebekah appeared at the well, when she offered water to both servant and camels, when she agreed to return with a stranger to marry a man she'd never met, she was participating unknowingly in the continuation of Abraham's secret life with God. The covenant promises were passing to a new generation through practical arrangements guided by divine orchestration. As Abraham's earthly journey neared its end, as his hair whitened completely and his steps grew more careful, he carried within himself the accumulated weight of a lifetime's worth of secret conversations with the divine. Each encounter had built upon the previous ones, creating a relationship of such depth and complexity that it defied easy explanation or casual sharing. The promises first spoken in Ur had been fulfilled in ways that revealed divine creativity beyond human imagination. The descendants numerous as stars were beginning to take shape through Isaac and Rebekah's union. The land promised to his offspring was being gradually occupied through strategic purchases and divine provision. The blessing that would reach all nations was being prepared through covenant relationships that would extend far beyond Abraham's own lifespan. But perhaps the greatest secret of Abraham's life wasn't about external promises at all. It was about the internal transformation that occurs when a human heart learns to live in ongoing conversation with the Eternal. His secret life had changed him from a successful but ultimately limited businessman into something resembling a divine partner in cosmic purposes that spanned generations. Rest now, dear listener, and let the profound weight of Abraham's extraordinary secret life settle into your consciousness like ancient starlight on desert sand. In our age of digital oversharing and compulsive connectivity, here was a man who understood that the most important conversations happen in whispers, that the most significant relationships are cultivated in silence, that the most transformative secrets are held not in devices or databases, but in hearts surrendered to mysteries larger than understanding. Sleep well in the knowledge that while our modern secrets are often about hiding shame or managing image, Abraham's secret life was about treasuring sacred encounters too precious for casual exposure, too profound for ordinary conversation, too holy for anything but quiet reverence in the presence of the eternal. The final years of Abraham's life brought a different kind of secret altogether. Where once his hidden conversations with the divine had been about receiving promises, now they were about releasing them. The man who had spent decades learning to hold impossible hopes was now learning the even more difficult art of letting go. In our world of 2025, we understand something about legacy planning. We have wills and trusts, digital asset management, succession planning for businesses. We worry about who will get our social media accounts after we're gone, how to pass on our Bitcoin passwords, whether our children will know the stories behind the photos stored in our cloud drives. We try to control our legacies through careful documentation and legal frameworks. But Abraham faced a far more complex inheritance challenge. How do you bequeath a secret life? How do you pass on decades of divine conversations to someone who hasn't heard the voice themselves? How do you transfer a relationship that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience? The answer Abraham was learning was both simpler and more complicated than any earthly inheritance. You couldn't will divine relationship to someone like property or teach it like a skill set. Each person had to develop their own secret life with God, their own pattern of encounter and response, their own history of impossible promises fulfilled in unexpected ways. Yet what Abraham could leave behind was something precious: the expectation that such conversations were possible, the confidence that the God who had spoken to him would continue speaking to those who followed, the framework for recognizing divine whispers in a noisy world. Think about how we prepare our children for their digital lives today. We teach them about privacy settings and online safety, about the difference between public and private information, about managing their digital footprints. We try to give them tools for navigating a connected world while protecting their authentic selves from the dangers of constant exposure. Abraham was preparing Isaac for something infinitely more complex. A life lived in conversation with the invisible, decision-making guided by inaudible voices, trust in promises that might take decades to materialize. The secret life he was passing on wasn't about hiding shameful behaviors or managing public image. It was about maintaining sacred relationship in a world that couldn't see or understand its source. The servant sent to find Isaac a wife carried more than gold and silver and careful instructions about bloodlines and cultural compatibility. He carried Abraham's quiet confidence that divine guidance would orchestrate the right meeting at the right moment. When Rebekah appeared at the well, offering water to both man and camels with the kind of generous spirit that echoed Sarah's hospitality, she was unknowingly participating in the continuation of Abraham's secret dialogue with eternity. But even this beautiful fulfillment of divine orchestration came wrapped in the kind of complexity that marked all of Abraham's encounters with the eternal. Isaac loved Rebekah deeply, found comfort in her after his mother's death, experienced the joy of covenant partnership. Yet their marriage would eventually produce its own secrets, its own divine encounters, its own tests of faith that would echo but not simply repeat Abraham's journey. The twins growing in Rebekah's womb, Jacob and Esau, represented the next generation of divine secrets. Before they were born, she received her own prophetic revelation about their destinies, her own impossible divine communication about the younger serving the older, about purposes that defied cultural expectations and practical logic. The secret life was multiplying, spreading, taking new forms in each generation. Abraham watched his family expand with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose impossible hopes were materializing in real time. the descendants numerous as stars were beginning to take visible form. The covenant promises were growing flesh and blood, developing personalities and relationships, creating the foundation for nations that would reshape human history. Yet he also understood that each fulfillment brought new mysteries, new challenges, new divine secrets to be carried by hearts, learning to trust in promises they couldn't yet fully comprehend. The pattern he had established of receiving impossible instructions and following them despite all evidence to the contrary was becoming a family inheritance, passed down not through genetic code, but through spiritual DNA. As Abraham's earthly story drew toward its close, his secret life evolved into something resembling divine friendship rather than desperate seeking. The urgent questions of his earlier decades had been answered, often in ways that exceeded his wildest imagination. The tests had been passed, the relationship established, the covenant confirmed through multiple generations of faithfulness proven and reciprocated. The conversations with the divine during these final years carried a different quality. Less dramatic revelation, more gentle companionship. Like old friends who had walked many miles together, they could communicate with fewer words, deeper understanding, the kind of intimacy that comes only through shared history of trust tested and proven reliable. When Abraham finally breathed his last breath, surrounded by the family that represented the beginning of fulfillment for promises spoken decades earlier in Mesopotamian moonlight, he carried with him secrets that had never been fully shared with any earthly companion. The deepest conversations of his spiritual life remained between himself and the divine, too sacred for casual recounting, too precious for ordinary words, too profound for anything but grateful silence. But the framework for such conversations lived on. Isaac had inherited not the content of his father's secret life, but the expectation that divine relationship was possible, normal, necessary. The altars Abraham had built throughout their travels served as physical reminders that the invisible God was present, active, interested in the daily details of human existence. The burial of Abraham in the cave of Machpelah beside Sarah wasn't just the end of one man's extraordinary journey. It was the planting of a seed in the promised land, the establishment of a permanent presence in territory that had been promised but not yet fully possessed. Even in death, Abraham was making a statement about divine faithfulness, about promises that extend beyond individual lifespans, about secrets that transcend mortal existence. In our modern understanding, we might say Abraham had lived a double life, one visible to his contemporaries, another hidden in divine conversation. But this wasn't the kind of duplicity we associate with secret lives today. There was no shame in his hiddenness, no deception in his privacy, no scandal waiting to be exposed by investigative journalists or social media detectives. Abraham's secret life was sacred life, protected not from embarrassment, but from trivialization, guarded not from legal consequences, but from casual consumption. He understood intuitively that some experiences with the eternal are too precious for public display, too profound for ordinary conversation, too holy for anything but reverent silence and personal contemplation. The legacy of Abraham's secret life extends far beyond his immediate family, though even they would carry forward the pattern of divine encounter in ways uniquely their own. Isaac would have his own secret conversations with the God of his father, his own impossible promises to trust, his own tests of faith that would refine his character and deepen his relationship with the eternal. Jacob would wrestle with divine messengers in the darkness, receiving new names and new callings that would reshape not just his identity, but the identity of nations yet to be born. Joseph would interpret dreams and navigate political intrigue with wisdom that came from sources his Egyptian colleagues couldn't identify or access. Moses would encounter burning bushes and receive tablets of stone inscribed with divine instructions for organizing human society. Each generation would develop its own secret life with the divine, its own pattern of encounter and response, its own history of promises received and fulfilled in unexpected ways. The framework Abraham established of expecting divine communication, responding in faith despite visible evidence to the contrary, and protecting sacred encounters from casual exposure would become the template for relationship with the eternal. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Abraham's secret life wasn't its content, but its accessibility. The God who spoke to him wasn't a tribal deity available only to a select few, wasn't a distant cosmic force uninterested in human affairs, wasn't a capricious ruler demanding appeasement through elaborate rituals. The divine presence Abraham encountered was personal, relational, interested in ongoing conversation, rather than mere ceremonial observance. This understanding of divine relationship would eventually revolutionize human spirituality, offering a model of faith based on trust rather than fear, relationship rather than ritual, covenant partnership rather than slave-master dynamics. Abraham's secret life became the foundation for billions of people across multiple religious traditions who would seek their own authentic encounters with the eternal. Yet even as Abraham's influence spread across centuries and continents, even as his story was recorded in sacred texts and taught in religious institutions worldwide, the essential nature of his secret life remained unchanged. Divine relationship, he had learned, couldn't be institutionalized or systematized or reduced to formulas and procedures. Each person had to develop their own secret life with God, their own pattern of encounter and response, their own history of trust, tested and proven reliable. In our hyper-connected age, where privacy is increasingly rare and secrets are often seen as problems to be solved rather than mysteries to be treasured, Abraham's example offers a different model. His secret life wasn't about hiding failure or managing reputation. It was about protecting sacred space, nurturing divine relationship, and maintaining the kind of spiritual intimacy that can only flourish in the quiet chambers of the heart. As you settle into sleep tonight, let the weight of Abraham's extraordinary secret life rest gently on your consciousness, like starlight on ancient stone. In a world where we hide our browser histories and carefully curate our online presence, here was a man whose secret life was a decades-long conversation with eternity itself, whose hidden reality was more substantial than anything visible to mortal eyes. Rest in the knowledge that the most profound secrets are not scandals to be exposed, but sacred truths to be treasured, not deceptions to be uncovered, but divine encounters to be protected, not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived. Some conversations are too holy for casual sharing, some relationships too precious for public display, some promises too profound for anything but quiet trust in the darkness. Sleep well, dear friend, knowing that the pattern Abraham established, of living in response to divine whispers, of trusting in promises that seem impossible, of maintaining secret conversations with the eternal, remains available to anyone willing to listen for voices that speak in silence, to wait for fulfillment that comes in God's perfect timing, to protect sacred encounters from the noise of a world that has forgotten how to treasure mystery. The secret life continues, passed down, not through genetic inheritance, but through spiritual invitation, available to every heart willing to guard sacred space, to listen for divine whispers, to trust in promises that exceed human understanding. Abraham's legacy isn't just historical, it's experiential, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to live in conversation with the eternal, to carry impossible hopes, to treasure sacred secrets in the quiet sanctuary of surrendered hearts. Tomorrow, in dreams or in waking, the invitation remains to develop your own secret life with the divine, your own pattern of encounter and response, your own history of trust tested and proven reliable. But for now, rest in the peace of knowing that some secrets are too sacred for words, too precious for exposure, too profound for anything but grateful silence in the presence of the eternal. The morning sun cast long shadows across Abraham's camp as he prepared for what would be his final journey. Not to another mountain of testing, not to negotiate with distant kings, not to seek new grazing lands for his ever-expanding herds. This journey was different, quieter, more personal, carrying the weight of a secret that had shaped every decision of his extraordinary life. In our digital age, we obsess over legacy management. We worry about our online presence outliving us, about who will maintain our social media accounts, about whether our digital photos will survive server crashes and platform changes. We create time capsules of our experiences, documenting every meal and moment, desperate to ensure we'll be remembered accurately by future generations who will scroll through our carefully curated lives. But Abraham faced a far more profound legacy challenge. How do you pass on conversations that others can't hear? How do you bequeath a relationship that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience? How do you ensure that the secret life that defined your existence continues to breathe and grow in hearts that have never heard the divine whisper themselves? The answer wasn't found in documentation or instruction manuals. Abraham couldn't write down the exact words spoken in those midnight encounters with the divine, couldn't create a step-by-step guide for hearing the voice of eternity, couldn't systematize the process of divine relationship into something transferable through ordinary teaching methods. Instead, he had to trust that the same God who had called him from Ur would continue calling, that the same voice that had promised descendants as numerous as stars would keep speaking to those who learned to listen, that the pattern he had established of expecting divine encounter and responding in faith would become a spiritual inheritance more valuable than gold or livestock. Consider how different this is from our contemporary approach to passing on what matters most. We create detailed estate plans, write ethical wills explaining our values, record video messages for future grandchildren we may never meet. We want to control not just what we leave behind materially, but how we're remembered, what lessons are preserved, which stories continue to be told. Abraham's approach required a different kind of trust entirely. He had to release control of his most precious possession, his relationship with the divine, and trust that it would continue to flourish in hearts he might never directly influence, in generations he would never see, in circumstances he couldn't predict or prepare for. The servants who had witnessed his strange habits, the altar building, the sudden changes in direction, the decisions that seemed to contradict practical wisdom, carried with them not theological explanations but lived examples. They had seen what it looked like when someone operated according to information others couldn't access, when practical choices were informed by invisible conversations, when impossible situations somehow resolved through divine intervention. These witnesses couldn't replicate Abraham's secret life, but they could testify to its reality. They had watched promises materialize in ways that defied natural explanation, had seen provision appear at moments of greatest need, had observed the calm confidence that comes from trusting in sources of guidance others couldn't verify. Isaac, now a man with his own growing family, carried forward not just his father's material wealth, but something far more valuable: the expectation that divine relationship was normal, accessible, necessary. The altars scattered across the landscape of his childhood served as physical reminders that the invisible God was present, active, interested in the practical details of nomadic existence. But Isaac's secret life wouldn't be a mere copy of Abraham's. Each generation, Abraham was learning, had to develop its own authentic relationship with the divine, its own pattern of encounter and response, its own history of promises received and fulfilled in unexpected ways. The framework could be inherited, but the content had to be personally discovered. This understanding brought both comfort and concern to Abraham's aging heart. Comfort, because it meant the divine relationship he treasured wasn't limited to his own experience. It was available to anyone willing to listen for voices that speak in silence, to trust in promises that seem impossible, to live in response to guidance others couldn't verify. Concern, because it meant each person also faced the choice of whether to cultivate such relationship or to settle for the visible, practical, controllable aspects of existence. Rebecca's arrival in their household had demonstrated this principle beautifully. She hadn't inherited divine relationship through marriage to Isaac, but she had quickly developed her own encounters with the Eternal. The prophecy she received about her twin sons, that the older would serve the younger, came directly to her, not filtered through her husband's spiritual experience or her father-in-law's established pattern of divine conversation. The twins growing in her womb represented the next generation of secret carriers, though their approaches to divine relationship would be as different as their personalities. Jacob would wrestle with angels and scheme his way into blessing, learning that divine purposes could be accomplished even through flawed human instruments. Esau would choose immediate gratification over eternal inheritance, demonstrating that proximity to divine promise didn't guarantee participation in divine purpose. Abraham watched these developing family dynamics with the perspective of someone whose secret life had taught him to see beyond immediate circumstances to eternal patterns. The conflicts between his grandsons weren't just sibling rivalry. They were the working out of divine purposes that extended far beyond individual preferences or family harmony. In our modern context, we might expect Abraham to intervene, to use his patriarchal authority to smooth over family tensions, to apply conflict resolution techniques or family therapy principles to create harmony. We believe in managing outcomes, controlling environments, engineering solutions to relational problems. But Abraham's secret life had taught him something different. That divine purposes often work through human complexities rather than around them. That God's plans don't require perfect people or harmonious circumstances. That the most significant spiritual inheritances often emerge from the most challenging family dynamics. This didn't mean he was passive or uncaring about his family's struggles. Rather, his secret conversations with the divine had given him a longer perspective, a deeper trust in outcomes he couldn't control or predict. He could love his grandsons equally while understanding that their destinies were different, could pray for family harmony while accepting that divine purposes might require family tension. The merchant caravans that passed through Abraham's territory carried more than trade goods. They carried stories. Tales of the wealthy nomad who had somehow accumulated vast flocks and herds while living in tents, who commanded respect from kings and common traders alike, who seemed to navigate the complex politics of tribal alliances with wisdom that exceeded his formal education or cultural background. What these storytellers couldn't convey was the source of Abraham's remarkable success in negotiation and relationship building. They described his fairness in business dealings, his generosity and hospitality, his reliability in keeping agreements, but they had no framework for understanding that these qualities flowed from a secret life that had been shaped by decades of divine encounter. Abraham's reputation for wisdom wasn't based on accumulated knowledge or strategic thinking. It was the overflow of a heart that had learned to distinguish between temporal and eternal perspectives, between human wisdom and divine insight, between outcomes he could influence and results that were ultimately in divine hands. When neighboring chieftains sought his counsel in disputes, when traders asked his advice about route selection, when younger men requested guidance about family decisions, they were accessing the practical benefits of Abraham's secret life without understanding its source. His advice was sound because it was filtered through relationship with eternal wisdom, his judgment fair because it was informed by divine justice, his counsel helpful because it emerged from conversations with the one who saw all outcomes simultaneously. But Abraham never confused the blessing with the blessing giver, never treated his accumulated wisdom as personal achievement rather than divine gift. His secret life had taught him that every insight, every successful negotiation, every wise decision was the result of relationship rather than individual brilliance. The physical landmarks of Abraham's journey, the altars at Shechem and Bethel, the well at Beersheba, the terebinth trees at Mamre, served as more than geographical markers. They were monuments to divine encounter, physical reminders of invisible conversations, tangible evidence of intangible relationship. Future generations would look at these stone altars and remember not just that Abraham had worshipped there, but that he had heard from God there, that impossible promises had been spoken there, that divine relationship had been cultivated there. The stones couldn't transmit the content of those encounters, but they could testify to their reality. In our Instagram age, we might say Abraham was creating spiritual hashtags, marking locations where significant encounters had occurred. But unlike our digital breadcrumbs that can be deleted or lost to platform changes, Abraham's stone markers were built to last, to survive weather and warfare, to speak to generations who would pass by centuries later. Each altar told a story that words couldn't fully capture. Here, a man learned to trust in promises that contradicted visible evidence. Here, divine timing was revealed to be different from human scheduling. Here, the impossible was spoken into existence through relationship with the eternal. The herds and flocks that represented Abraham's material wealth were themselves testimonies to divine provision. These weren't just the result of shrewd animal husbandry or favorable market conditions. They were the tangible manifestation of blessings spoken in secret conversations, promises fulfilled through practical means that nonetheless required divine coordination of countless variables. Every healthy calf, every successful breeding season, every favorable trade negotiation was evidence of a secret life that had learned to recognize divine fingerprints on ordinary circumstances. Abraham's prosperity wasn't separate from his spirituality. It was the natural overflow of relationship with the source of all blessing. Yet he had also learned through experience that material blessing could become a trap if it displaced relationship with the blessing giver. The test on Mount Moriah had burned away any possibility of confusing God's gifts with God himself, any temptation to worship provision rather than provider. This understanding shaped how Abraham approached the management of his growing wealth. Every business decision was made by someone who understood the difference between stewardship and ownership. Every investment choice was informed by relationship with the ultimate owner of everything. Every act of generosity flowed from a heart that had learned to hold material blessings with open hands. The seasonal rhythms of nomadic life, the migrations in search of grazing, the negotiations for water rights, the careful management of breeding cycles, were all conducted within the framework of Abraham's secret life. What appeared to observers as skilled animal husbandry and shrewd resource management was actually the practical outworking of divine guidance received in quiet moments of prayer and meditation. When drought threatened the region and other herders panicked about their animals' survival, Abraham faced the same practical challenges, but with additional resources. Not because he received daily weather reports from divine sources, but because his secret life had taught him to distinguish between circumstances he could control and outcomes that were ultimately in divine hands. This produced a quality of leadership that others found both attractive and mysterious. Abraham's calm in crisis wasn't based on superior planning or hidden information. It was the result of decades of learning to trust in divine provision, even when provision seemed impossible. The marriage negotiations for Isaac revealed another dimension of Abraham's secret life in action. Sending his most trusted servant on such a crucial mission, with nothing more than general instructions and confident prayers, seemed reckless by ordinary standards. In our age of background checks and compatibility assessments, of dating apps and relationship algorithms, Abraham's approach to finding his son a wife appears almost negligently casual. But his confidence wasn't based on leaving everything to chance. It was grounded in decades of witnessing divine orchestration of circumstances far more complex than matchmaking. The same God who had provided a ram in the thicket at the moment of greatest need could certainly arrange for the right woman to appear at the right well at the right time. When Rebecca demonstrated exactly the character qualities the servant had privately prayed for, when she agreed to travel hundreds of miles to marry a man she'd never met, when Isaac found comfort in her after his mother's death, these weren't coincidences, but confirmations of the kind of divine coordination Abraham had learned to expect and depend upon. The servant's report of his journey, filled with details about prayer answered and guidance received, added another layer to the household's understanding of how divine relationship operated in practical situations. The next generation was learning through lived example what it meant to involve the eternal in temporal decisions, to seek divine guidance for ordinary challenges, to expect supernatural coordination of natural circumstances. As Abraham's earthly story drew toward its close, his secret life evolved into something resembling peaceful completion rather than urgent seeking. The desperate questions of his earlier decades had been answered, often in ways that far exceeded his original hopes. The tests had been passed, the relationship established, the covenant confirmed, through multiple generations of faithfulness proven and reciprocated. The conversations with the divine during these final years carried a different quality, less dramatic revelation, more gentle companionship. Like old friends who had walked many difficult roads together, they could communicate with fewer words, deeper understanding. The kind of intimacy that comes only through shared history of trust, tested and proven reliable across decades of impossible circumstances. Yet even this peaceful phase of Abraham's secret life continued to produce fruit. His presence in the region had become a stabilizing influence. His reputation for fairness and wisdom drew people from distant territories seeking counsel and mediation. What they encountered wasn't just an elderly patriarch with accumulated experience, but someone whose character had been shaped by a lifetime of divine encounter. The impact of Abraham's secret life extended far beyond his immediate family or tribal connections. Trade routes were safer because of his influence. Territorial disputes were resolved more peacefully because of his mediation. Business practices were more honest because of his example. The invisible conversations that had shaped his character were producing visible benefits for entire communities. When Abraham finally breathed his last breath, surrounded by family that represented the beginning of fulfillment for promises spoken decades earlier in Mesopotamian darkness, he carried with him secrets that had never been fully shared with any earthly companion. The deepest conversations of his spiritual life remained between himself and the divine, too sacred for casual recounting, too precious for ordinary words, too profound for anything but grateful silence. But the framework for such conversations lived on, planted like seeds in hearts that had witnessed their power, established like foundations in lives that had been shaped by their influence. The pattern Abraham had established, of expecting divine encounter, responding in faith despite contrary evidence, protecting sacred conversations from casual exposure, had become a spiritual inheritance more valuable than any material legacy. Rest now, dear listener, and let the extraordinary weight of Abraham's completed secret life settle into your consciousness like ancient starlight on desert stone. In our age of digital transparency and compulsive sharing, here was a man who understood that the most important conversations happen in whispers, that the most transformative relationships are cultivated in silence, that the most valuable inheritances are passed through spiritual DNA rather than legal documents. Sleep well in the knowledge that Abraham's pattern of divine relationship, of listening for eternal voices in temporal noise, of trusting in promises that seem impossible, of protecting sacred encounters from casual consumption, remains available to anyone willing to guard secret space for holy conversation, to cultivate divine relationship in the quiet chambers of surrendered hearts. The morning Abraham breathed his last wasn't marked by divine voices or heavenly visitations. It was quiet, ordinary, filled with the gentle sounds of family moving about their daily tasks. Isaac sat beside his father's bedside, Rebekah nearby with her hand resting on her growing belly where Jacob and Esau wrestled, even in the womb. The servants went about their familiar routines, unaware that one of history's most extraordinary secret lives was drawing to its close. But what made Abraham's final moments so remarkable wasn't the absence of dramatic divine encounter. It was the presence of such deep, settled peace. After decades of carrying impossible secrets, of living in response to invisible conversations, of trusting in promises that defied every earthly logic, he faced death with the calm confidence of someone whose relationship with eternity had been tested and proven reliable across a lifetime of impossible circumstances. Think about how we approach death in our modern world. We have advanced directives and living wills, detailed medical interventions and palliative care protocols. We document our final wishes with lawyers and leave video messages for future generations. We try to control the timing, the circumstances, the very experience of our own dying through careful planning and medical management. Abraham had none of these modern comforts, yet he possessed something far more profound. The quiet certainty that death wasn't an ending, but a transition, not a failure, but a fulfillment, not a separation, but a deeper union with the divine voice that had shaped every decision of his remarkable journey. His secret life hadn't prepared him to avoid death, but to meet it as another divine appointment, another sacred encounter in the ongoing conversation that had defined his existence. The burial in the cave of Machpelah beside Sarah wasn't just a family funeral. It was the establishment of a permanent foothold in the promised land. After decades of living as nomads in territory that belonged to others, Abraham's final rest became the first legal claim his family made to the inheritance that had been promised but not yet fully possessed. Even in death, he was making a statement about divine faithfulness, about promises that transcend individual lifespans. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Abraham's passing was what happened to his secret life after his earthly conversations ended. You might expect that such an intensely personal relationship would die with the man who had cultivated it. Instead, something remarkable occurred. The pattern he had established began to multiply, to take new forms, to echo through generations in ways that would reshape human understanding of divine relationship forever. Isaac didn't inherit his father's specific encounters, but he did inherit the expectation that such encounters were possible, normal, necessary. The altars Abraham had built throughout their travels served as physical reminders that the invisible God was present, active, interested in the practical details of daily existence. When Isaac faced his own challenges, drought, territorial disputes, the complexities of managing a growing household, he naturally turned to the same divine source his father had relied upon. But Isaac's secret life developed its own unique characteristics. Where Abraham had been called to leave everything familiar and walk into the unknown, Isaac was called to stay, to dig wells, to establish permanent presence in the land his father had traversed as a nomad. His divine conversations weren't about impossible journeys, but about patient cultivation, not about dramatic tests, but about steady faithfulness in ordinary circumstances. The wells Isaac dug became their own kind of altar, their own monuments to divine provision. When hostile neighbors filled them with dirt, when territorial disputes threatened to escalate into violence, when the practical challenges of settled life pressed in around him, Isaac responded with the same quiet trust his father had demonstrated in far more dramatic circumstances. His secret life with God was less theatrical, but no less real, less visible, but equally transformative. Rebecca brought her own dimension to the family's expanding secret life. The prophecy she received about her twin sons, that the older would serve the younger, came directly to her, not filtered through her husband's spiritual experience or her father-in-law's established pattern of divine conversation. This wasn't derivative spirituality, but original encounter. Proof that divine relationship was available to anyone willing to listen for voices that speak in silence. The twins themselves would carry forward the family's secret life in ways that diverged dramatically from each other. Jacob would wrestle with angels in the darkness, receiving new names and new callings that would reshape not just his identity, but the identity of nations yet to be born. His encounters with the divine would be physical, intense, transformative in ways that left him literally changed, walking with a limp that served as permanent reminder of his midnight wrestling match with eternity. Esau, by contrast, would choose immediate satisfaction over eternal inheritance, demonstrating that proximity to divine promise didn't guarantee participation in divine purpose. His story became a cautionary tale about the difference between understanding spiritual inheritance intellectually and embracing it personally, between knowing about divine relationship and cultivating divine relationship for oneself. The servants and neighbors who had witnessed Abraham's strange habits, his altar building, his sudden changes in direction, his decisions that seemed to contradict practical wisdom, carried with them not theological explanations, but lived testimonies. They had seen what it looked like when someone operated according to information others couldn't access, when practical choices were informed by invisible conversations, when impossible situations somehow resolved through divine intervention. These witnesses couldn't replicate Abraham's secret life, but they could testify to its reality. They had watched promises materialize in ways that defied natural explanation, had seen provision appear at moments of greatest need, had observed the calm confidence that comes from trusting in sources of guidance others couldn't verify. Their stories would spread through trade routes and tribal networks, carrying echoes of Abraham's extraordinary relationship with the Eternal to communities that had never met him personally. The merchant caravans that had passed through Abraham's territory carried more than goods and stories. They carried a new understanding of what divine relationship could look like. The tales they told weren't just about a wealthy nomad who had somehow accumulated vast herds while living in tents, but about someone whose character had been shaped by encounters with an invisible but undeniably present God. These stories would plant seeds in hearts across the ancient world, creating expectations that divine relationship was possible, personal, practical. People who had grown up thinking of gods as distant forces requiring elaborate appeasement began to wonder whether the divine might actually be interested in ongoing conversation, in daily partnership, in relationship, rather than mere ritual observance. The impact extended far beyond individual spiritual development. Communities influenced by Abraham's example began to operate according to different principles, more honest in business dealings, more generous in hospitality, more reliable in keeping agreements. The invisible conversations that had shaped one man's character were producing visible benefits for entire societies. Kings and chieftains who had negotiated with Abraham remembered not just his fairness in specific transactions, but his approach to decision-making, his way of considering long-term consequences alongside immediate benefits, his ability to find solutions that honored all parties involved. They couldn't explain the source of his wisdom, but they recognized its effectiveness and began incorporating similar principles into their own leadership practices. The legal precedent established by Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah created a new model for property acquisition in a region where might typically made right. His insistence on paying full price for the burial site, on conducting the transaction publicly at the city gate, on establishing clear legal title rather than simply taking what he wanted. These practices influenced how future generations would approach land ownership and business relationships. But perhaps the most far-reaching impact of Abraham's secret life was its effect on human understanding of divine character itself. The God Abraham encountered wasn't the capricious deity of surrounding cultures, demanding constant appeasement and offering no guarantee of faithfulness in return. This was a covenant-making God, a promise-keeping God, a God who initiated relationship and sustained it across decades of human uncertainty and failure. This understanding would eventually revolutionize human spirituality, offering a model of faith based on trust rather than fear, relationship rather than ritual, covenant partnership rather than slave-master dynamics. Abraham's secret conversations had revealed a divine character that was personal, relational, interested in ongoing dialogue rather than mere ceremonial observance. The pattern he established, of expecting divine communication, responding in faith despite visible evidence to the contrary, protecting sacred encounters from casual exposure, would become the template for authentic spiritual relationship across multiple religious traditions. Billions of people in centuries to come would seek their own version of Abraham's secret life, their own authentic encounters with the eternal, their own history of impossible promises fulfilled in unexpected ways. Yet even as Abraham's influence spread across continents and cultures, even as his story was recorded in sacred texts and taught in religious institutions worldwide, the essential nature of his secret life remained unchanged. Divine relationship, he had demonstrated, couldn't be institutionalized or systematized or reduced to formulas and procedures. Each person had to develop their own secret life with God, their own pattern of encounter and response, their own history of trust tested and proven reliable. The framework could be inherited. The expectation that divine conversation was possible. The confidence that eternal purposes were being worked out through temporal circumstances. The understanding that some experiences were too sacred for casual sharing. But the content had to be personally discovered, individually cultivated, authentically experienced, rather than simply borrowed from someone else's spiritual journey. This is what made Abraham's legacy so extraordinary and so accessible. He hadn't created an exclusive club of spiritual elites or established a hierarchy of divine favoritism. Instead, he had demonstrated that the kind of relationship he enjoyed with the eternal was available to anyone willing to listen for voices that speak in silence, to trust in promises that seem impossible, to protect sacred encounters from the noise of a world that had forgotten how to treasure mystery. In our hyperconnected age of 2025, where privacy is increasingly rare and secrets are often seen as problems to be solved rather than mysteries to be treasured, Abraham's example offers a radically different model. His secret life wasn't about hiding failure or managing reputation. It was about protecting sacred space, nurturing divine relationship, maintaining the kind of spiritual intimacy that can only flourish in the quiet chambers of the heart. The conversations he guarded so carefully weren't shameful secrets requiring concealment, but precious encounters deserving protection. The promises he carried weren't embarrassing delusions needing explanation, but sacred truths requiring stewardship. The relationship he cultivated wasn't a private indulgence demanding justification, but a divine partnership producing transformation that blessed everyone it touched. As you settle into sleep tonight, let the profound weight of Abraham's completed secret life rest gently on your consciousness, like ancient starlight on desert stone. In a world where we hide our browser histories and carefully curate our online presence, here was a man whose secret life was a decades-long conversation with eternity itself, whose hidden reality was more substantial than anything visible to mortal eyes. His story reminds us that while our modern secrets are often about hiding shame or managing image, the most meaningful secret lives are about treasuring sacred encounters, too precious for casual exposure, too profound for ordinary conversation, too holy for anything but reverent protection in the silence of surrendered hearts. Rest in the knowledge that Abraham's pattern of divine relationship, of listening for eternal voices in temporal noise, of trusting in promises that seem impossible, of protecting sacred conversations from casual consumption, remains available to anyone willing to guard secret space for holy encounter, to cultivate divine relationship in the quiet sanctuary of the heart, to live in response to whispers that speak louder than the shouting of the world. Sleep well, dear friend, knowing that the most profound secrets are not scandals to be exposed, but sacred truths to be treasured, not deceptions to be uncovered, but divine encounters to be protected, not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived. The secret life continues, passed down not through genetic inheritance, but through spiritual invitation, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to listen for the voice that still calls across the centuries, still speaks in the silence, still offers the same impossible promises to hearts willing to carry them in secret trust. Sweet dreams, and may your own secret life with the divine begin to unfold in the quiet hours ahead. Written not in digital code, but in the ancient language of faith, hope, and love that transcends time itself.